Great.
All right. We'll pop this open like this. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to our webinar today. My name is Tom Schoenborn. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Instructional Technologies. We're the company that makes PRO-TREAD. Today, we're going to be talking about GHS training and enforcement, some trends, and obviously reviewing what the GHS training requirement is for the OSHA Hazcom new rule. With us today, we have Greg Pattison from GLP Systems Inc. He is the Vice President of Training there. Greg was also the subject matter expert who helped us build our GHS training program that's in PRO-TREAD. And so with that, I'm going to let Greg introduce himself. And while he's doing that, I'm going to be switching over and giving him control of the presentation. So Greg, go ahead and say hello to everybody and introduce yourself while I'm playing with the computer.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. My name's Greg Pattison, and I'm the Vice President of Training, and I do a lot of technical training on site. I do webinars like this, and then I help design as a subject matter expert online training with PRO-TREAD. So today we're here to talk about the biggest change in OSHA in 20 years, which is GHS. It's the Global Harmonized System of Classifying and Labeling of Chemicals. Now keep in mind that this was started in 1993 by the UN, and the United States signed up for the program, but it's taken a long and circuitous route to get to GHS in the U.S. And a final rule was handed down in 2012. And at that time, GHS was made part of the Hazardous Communication Standard under OSHA. So keep in mind that when we talk about this, that GHS is part of your Hazcom plan. And as such, you need to make it a written part. So let's see.
So Greg,
I'm not having any luck making this go forward.
So, okay. Well,
can you click the next screen, please?
Yes, absolutely. There you go.
Okay. So where we're at, folks, is under the right of the worker to know under OSHA, the two factors that I want to highlight here, and all of these are part of the right to know, but the two that we want to talk about is workers in the workplace have a right to know about hazardous chemicals. And as such, once they know about them, any hazardous chemicals that are introduced to the workplace, each employee needs to be trained. So that's the two components that we're going to talk about today. And then as you can see, there are other components of the right to know focus. But the two that we want to focus on is hazardous chemicals and the training required for those hazardous chemicals. Could you click the... Okay, so folks, let's keep in mind that how GHS fits into the OSHA Hazcom plan. And I know this is a graphic, but I want to just focus on the middle part of it, which is OSHA standards. The OSHA Hazcom standard is 1910-1200, and it feeds down to GHS and the training. And as part of Hazcom, you have to have a written GHS plan. You have to have a library. So the MSDS sheets that you currently have to be converted to SDS. And then the first phase-in component of GHS was that all workers were to be trained by December 1 of 2013 on GHS. And obviously, we have a very strong program that is on the PRO-TREAD website, and it takes about an hour to hour and a half for the average person, but that is the reason we developed that program. So let's move on to the next slide. There are really four main components that is required of GHS training. And the first one, we talked about the material safety data sheets, your current ones, and I hope that each and every one of you are migrating from MSDS sheets to the SDS. And that is a big change from SDS to MSDS because of the risk profile. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but suffice it to say that in the past, the MSDS sheets, the most risky was number 5. Under the current SDS, the most risky or dangerous is number 1. And then the second component of GHS training is labeling. And there's simply too many components to put in this box. And since that hasn't been phased in yet, and still it's still permissible to use NFPA labels, NFPA or HMIS labels. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about labeling as it's going to become more prevalent in future webinars that we do. Number 3 is communication. And you have to get an update on your Hazcom plan, as I said, with the chemical hazards, their classifications, their pictograms, which there are 9 pictograms now, 8 of which OSHA jurisdicts, and then the signal words, of which there are 2. And finally, and what we're trying to do here today is to get an emphasis on the training, is the GHS training was to be done by December 1 of 2013, or you risk an OSHA citation and fine. And that you specifically have to be trained on an SDS sheet with a 16-section standardized format with one of the chemicals prevalent in your workplace, and then the labels and the components of that. So those are the 4 main components that each and every worker and supervisor needs to be trained on. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, as we talked about your right to know, we talked about the labeling, we talked about the safety data sheets. Worker training. There are 2 types of hazards, the physical hazards and the health hazards of these chemicals. So once those are established, then workers are to be instructed on how to protect themselves and how to implement workaround strategies, work practices to make it safer, emergency procedures, and then, of course, personal protective equipment. And once you talk or maintain that the worker needs some type of PPE, then they're required to be trained on it, which means which one to use, under what circumstances, how to put it on, take it off, adjust it, care for it, and dispose of it properly. So those are the components of the PPE standard under HCS, the Hazardous Communication Standard, and GHS. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, your right to training. As we talked about, the employers are responsible for this training. Supervisors and managers are to be trained as well, and OSHA came out after the final rule 2012 and said that first responders who may show up in an emergency with a hazardous chemical spill or incident need to be trained on GHS as well, so that they'll know the common terminology, phrases, pictures, graphics, and that type of thing. Let's move on to the next slide. I took this off of the OSHA website, which is www.osha.gov. And this was one of their fact sheets that talked about training required December 1 of 2013 for the Hazcom standard, of which it says right on this, that GHS is a part of. So this phase-in will start. It started December 1 of 2013 and will continue until GHS is fully phased in on June 1 of 2016. So there are 3 or 4 milestones within that. But as of the current situation, only the training on GHS is required and not the additional phase-in changes. Let's move on. Okay. Dr. David Michaels is the top enforcement officer for OSHA. And he travels around the country. In fact, I'm going to show you his, he's got his own webpage on the OSHA website. He was quoted as saying, for many employers, investing in job safety happens only when they have adequate incentives to comply with OSHA's requirements. Higher penalties and more aggressive, targeted enforcement will provide a greater deterrent to further encourage these employers to furnish safe and healthy workplaces for their employees. What that really means is that he wants to see more citations written, he wants to see more inspections done, and he wants to see more fines levied because he thinks that encourages safe and healthy workplace for employees. And as part of that, if you look in the final 2012 ruling, deep within the body of that is in the appendices, OSHA made certain assumptions, and they made some cost assumptions on how much money it would save, and then how many deaths it would reduce, and how many hospitalizations it would reduce. And what they maintained was it would save 43 lives a year, so those fatalities would not happen as a result of an implementation of GHS, and then approximately 2,000 fewer hospitalizations that result now from hazardous chemicals. Let's move on. Why the change to Hazcom? Well, 67 nations have adopted GHS in pretty much the same format as we have it now. And the logic behind the United Nations doing it was to make it smoother, more coherent, easier to approach and classify chemicals throughout the world, and then increase the understanding of the chemical health and physical hazards of those chemicals. And a huge component of the UN mandate was to facilitate training and foster further training. In fact, there's a component where refresher training on GHS is required every 2 years. And then finally, because of the many languages throughout the world, these pictograms that I'm going to show you in a few minutes are international representations. They're graphics, and they'll help reduce literacy problems and misunderstanding in the verbiage or the words within the MSDS or SDSs. So that's the rationale behind the United Nations moving to the GHS standard. Let's move on to the next slide. This slide here has the different components of the phase-in of GHS, but the one we're really here to focus on is December 1, 2013, which was supposed to be the date for training employees on the new label elements in the SDS format and those other components we talked about earlier. And as you see there on the right, the responsible party are the employers. And then June 1 of 2015, they want compliance of all the final rule of 2012, except they're not as concerned about the manufacturers because they feel like in their warehouses there's about 6 months of materials left to use up all of the existing labels and whatnot. And then after December 1 of 2015, no one can ship and no one can import or export without a proper GHS label. And then finally, the final component of GHS comes into play on June 1 of 2016. And again, it's an employer mandated part of the GHS standard. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, we talked about training a little bit, but the hazardous materials and hazardous chemicals, you have to do GHS as we talked about. The operations within work areas where these hazardous chemicals are present, and I'm sure most of you have standard operating procedures or SOPs for these hazardous chemicals. You have to make available a written GHS program that can be part of your hazard communication written program. In lieu of that, some folks have had in the past a hazardous chemical inventory, and now will be required to have SDSs, and those certainly can be online in hard copy. But one of the things that the OSHA inspectors that I deal with here in Atlanta, they maintain they don't like to see just electronic MSDSs or now SDSs, because if there's a power outage, which is a huge problem in a lot of incidents, then the data on those chemicals are not available electronically, so they still believe you need a backup hard copy in the work area where the hazard chemicals are. And then another component of the training is, of course, how you detect, contain, preserve, maintain the proper release and dispose of these hazardous chemicals, because they don't want these put in the environment or to affect the public at large. We talked earlier about the physical and the health hazards, which we're going to talk about the pictograms in a few minutes, and they'll kind of show some of those. And then we talked about the PPEs and the methods and measures to protect workers from these hazards. And then, of course, all of that's put in an overall hazardous communications plan. So that's what the training is supposed to cover under the GHS. Let's move on. Okay, folks. Since you must have a written Hazcom plan, the safety data sheets, there needs to be, as part of the plan, someone that's responsible in the workplace for obtaining and maintaining the SDSs, and someone that's responsible for converting the current MSDSs to the SDS. How those data sheets are maintained, if they're electronic or hard copy or both. And of course, now with the shipment of most chemicals, the SDS is supposed to be sent based on the agreement of the 67 nations. They're supposed to send an SDS with that first shipment. However, I caution you that if one of the nations that didn't sign on, you were to get a chemical from that country, they may or may not send with that first shipment that SDS. So, and then another component of the SDS and the GHS plan, written plan is if they find that a chemical creates new or significant health information. So if it becomes in one of the governing body a carcinogen, or it has greater toxicity, or over prolonged usage, the permissible limits change and the exposure, then you are required to train and pass that information along to your workers under the Hazcom plan. Let's move on to the next slide. Here are the pictograms, and as you can see, there are 9 of them, but only 8 are regulated by OSHA. As you can see in the one that's got the fish and the tree, that one is in blue, and it's regulated by the Department of Environmental Quality in each state. So that one, while OSHA does not want you to pollute the environment, that's a different agency, and the EPA work hand in hand with the DEQ. So all the other 8, though, are jurisdicted by OSHA, and those are the pictograms which will be on every safety data sheet. And they'll list health hazards, physical hazards, and then on the one, the environmental hazard. Let's move on to the next slide.
Greg, this is Tom. I just wanted to sort of, while we're here and then moving on to this next slide, and you were talking about jurisdiction here, I thought it would be a good time to bring up a question that we've gotten from a couple of people, which is, does a driver who is not endorsed for hazmat, but obviously has to go through and do the Hazcom training, do they need to do GHS training? You know, one of the rationale that we've heard from some people is that, you know, that the DOT, you know, has jurisdiction, and thus, you know, and since they're not transporting hazardous materials, and when the materials are in transit, it's covered by the DOT. And can you talk a little bit about that jurisdiction and especially sort of how it relates to, you know, for example, the diesel fuel here, which is the slide we've got.
Sure. Well, anyone that handles diesel fuel, that's considered a hazardous chemical, hazardous material under OSHA. As well, I might add, under DOT. Now, when a product is in, or the truck or the vehicle is in transit, it's covered by DOT. But while the driver's driving or filling up his vehicle with diesel fuel, he's in the workplace as well. So there's joint jurisdiction, and that does not exempt the driver from not getting the proper training. So whenever I talk to my customers and my clients, I say, okay, do you have a Hazcom plan? If they say yes, then as part of the Hazcom plan is GHS. So absolutely they have to be trained. In addition, the way the final rule read is anyone that is near the workplace, walks through the workplace, or may have to go to the workplace in an emergency needs to be trained on GHS as well. So oftentimes you have to train much of your workforce because they may be involved in a chemical incident. But getting back to your question, Tom, the driver, whether hazmat endorsed or not, every driver is required to get GHS training. And a good example is this of the diesel fuel here. And while I don't want to spend a whole lot of time at the top, I do want to spend time where the parenthesis is, because what if they had an incident with diesel fuel and the GHS label, these symbols were on there? Well, they typically wouldn't know what a, flammable, a health hazard, which is the second one with the human body, and then an exclamation mark, which is not as severe as the skull and crossbone one that we showed, less severe, but still acute toxicity. And then they wouldn't know what the signal words were, which there are two. On this one, it's danger. On some other ones, it may be warning, but they wouldn't know that, and then they wouldn't know what the hazard statements were because they haven't been trained on them. So for these reasons, they have to be trained on an SDS to understand the safety data sheet and what to do in an emergency. And without that GHS training, they aren't qualified or competent to do that. Does that answer your question, Tom?
It does, thanks.
Sure. let's move on to the next slide. Okay. These pictograms, again, you know, what I do is when I go into a customer site, I do an on-site or do webinars like this or send folks to, you know, PRO-TREAD, I say, can your workers identify these? And if they can't, then they need the training, because these are part of the Hazard Communication Standard going forward and should be part of your revised HCS standard, and part of that is the GHS. Let's move on to the next slide. Here's a hazard statement, and some examples are flammable, liquid, and vapor, can cause skin irritation, may cause cancer. But what I really want you to focus on for a minute is, again, we've got the 9 pictograms, and above it you see where it says Hazcom standard pictograms. It doesn't say GHS standard pictograms. So they've enforced and melded into the Hazcom standard these pictograms. And I'm told that DOT is going to honor these pictograms and leave them the same going forward in all of their rulings. But I'm told that I haven't seen anything that's been printed yet. But since we've adopted this internationally and the U.S. has adopted it nationally, it just makes sense to use these graphics rather than create new ones and confuse people. Let's move on. Okay, here's Dr. David Michaels again. He's got his own web page. It's a Hazcom web page, and it changes often, so I would suggest you go to it. But as you can see in the upper left-hand corner is the GHS hand in hand with the Hazcom standard, and then he's talking about it there about how important your HCS is and how important GHS is a part of that. So as you can see, OSHA, because this is the biggest change in 20 years, they're really promoting, and you know they've got 1,200 or so inspectors that on a daily basis are supposed to be doing a couple of inspections or more a day. So these folks are out there, and the biggest citation is the HCS Hazcom standard. There are more citations written for that, and a lot of those are failure to train. So don't put yourself at risk by not providing this GHS training, because if you get the citation, then you're going to have a problem with not only you'll be exposed to your competitors, it'll be published in the Federal Register, and your insurance company will raise your rates because your EMR will change. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Here's some additional areas for the OSHA federal resources. You can go and look at the Hazcom 2012 final rule. They've even got a comparison side by side on the 1994 rule and the 2012 rule. They got a lot of frequently asked questions. And then OSHA has put out a lot of, if you look at those cards to the right, those are OSHA quick cards, and they've got them on labeling, the safety data sheets. The top one that we see here is the pictograms, and then of course the effective dates. And then also you can go to the URL there under the OSHA Guide to GHS, and if you go to that URL right under there, there's a wealth of information there about Hazcom and GHS. So, and then the Purple Book, it's linked to the UN Purple Book, which was the original 1993 version of GHS, which is carried through by the UN until now. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is, I know it's a little bit busy and I apologize, but I wanted to show you the GHS Hazard Communication Standard flow chart. So we start there at the top. Is your material a hazardous chemical? Refer to OSHA. If it is, then you've got to have an MSDS or now soon an SDS. You refer to that library. And then you must provide workers with the GHS training if yes. And then you also have to have training for, of course, the workers, which we talked about. It can be to, through, or from the workplace where the hazardous chemicals are, any contractors, any vendors, any visitors, and first responders are supposed to be trained. And if yes, then GHS now is part of that Hazcom standard. And then we talked about the milestones to phase in the other components of GHS, fully implemented by June 2016. And a refresher is required every 2 years. And then, at the bottom, you have to continually search for hazardous chemicals or changes in the literature, the knowledge base of exposure risk, and that type of thing, and analyze that, because if new hazards or new information for those hazards are in the workplace, you're required to train workers on those. So and the training for those include the SDS format, timeline for the GHS rollout, pictograms, and labels. So that's really the flow chart that I think is important. And if you have the MSDS sheets, you're required to do that under the Hazcom standard. And then finally, that's really the end of my my talk, but I want to turn it back over to Tom because I'm sure he's got some additional information to provide to you folks.
Thanks, Greg. While I'm switching back over to the other presentation, a question that we'd had was you'd mentioned back here the training for workers, contractors, vendors, and first responders. Can you talk a little bit about what sorts of forms training might take for something like contractors, visitors, and vendors? Just real shortly and sort of generally.
Yes. Well, the one thing is they need to be trained on at least an outline of what the Hazcom standard is, where the MSDS or now the SDS sheets are housed, what to do in an emergency, what your standard operating procedures are, maybe a welfare or a safe area that folks are to convene if something happens, how to render aid, who to call in an emergency. Those types of components are required, and then what are the chemicals in the workplace so they're aware of what chemicals are there. So those are the components that they want contractors, vendors, first responders to know about.
Okay. Cool. Well, Greg, thank you so much for that wealth of information. Obviously, the reason that we reached out to you was your expertise in this area, and with that expertise, we were able to build the GHS training program within PRO-TREAD, which is obviously part of the hazard communication standard, and so I just wanted to sort of remind folks a little bit about it. Obviously, working with Greg, we made sure that the GHS training is going to meet all of the OSHA requirements for GHS training. It can all be done online, can be taken at home or at work. In the next month or two, it will be available on the iPhone, iPad, Android mobile devices. Like all PRO-TREAD training, it is mastery-based training. It's 100% compliance guaranteed. They have to get questions along the way correct, otherwise it backs them up, and they do that section again. If they get it right, they keep going. If they get it wrong, it backs them up to the section so that they make sure they do it, which is really important if when it comes to being able to show those training records in the event that there is some sort of OSHA inspection. like also the rest of PRO-TREAD, we did work really hard to make it simple and straightforward, using language that most people can understand, concepts that are really simple to understand, really demonstrating what we're talking about on screen, using on-screen text, and actually, sort of showing the things that are happening. Obviously, the record keeping and reporting are included in the learning management system that comes with PRO-TREAD, as well as the ability to go ahead and print out those certificates of completion if that's something that you want. And that's something that you can do at any time, actually printing those certificates out. In the meantime, all of the records are kept by us. You have access to them at any time. The reason we keep them is so that there can be your records become somewhat impeachable in that way, or unimpeachable rather. You can't manipulate them in any way, shape, or form there. In fact, we actually really struggle to manipulate them, and that's the way we built them, is to be in that sort of a frozen box. And obviously, we'd like to encourage you to get started today. If you do have any questions about getting started with GHS, there is a small premium charge for GHS training to add it into your PRO-TREAD menu for your drivers. Sell it on a seat basis so that your people can take it, however, whenever they need to when you bring them on. And Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, that once somebody is hired, I believe they have 90 days, 60 days to.
It's 90 days under the requirement. 90 days of initial hiring to get the training.
Right. Outstanding. Well, give us a call. Reach out, talk to Rich Brown or Marius Karoy or one of your account reps, either Jennifer Pope or Marlena here. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude. Thank you, Greg, very much for your time today, and as always for your expertise. We really appreciate it. And
well, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to do it.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Goodbye now.